to the 2025 Atlantic Coast Conference Debate Championship. We are very excited today to welcome you to the live stream of the championship debate. I'm one of the co-chairs of the ACC, Dr. Jared Atchison, and I serve as the John Kevin Medica Director of Debate at Wake Forest University. Today we have an amazing debate full of two teams that have already had 4 debates today. And over the course of those 4 debates, they've had 2 debates on the affirmative and 2 debates on the negative of the question of DC statehood. So today we have on the affirmative, brand new to the ACC, but not brand new to winning a lot of debates, Southern Methodist University, who's representing the affirmative, and on the negative, we have Wake Forest University. Our final round panel, if you ever watch any other ACC debate championships, will not be new to you. We have Ed Lee, James Rowland, and David Romanelli, who have judged the final championship multiple times and have always been phenomenal judges with great feedback. So without further ado, let's turn it over to SMU to have an amazing debate. Thank you all.
All right, if my judges are ready, and my opponents are ready? Great, so we have 6 minutes on the clock and we're going to start now. So hello, today we are standing in firm affirmation of the resolution, Washington, D.C. should be granted statehood. As it stands, 700,000 citizens of the United States are taxed without representation. Their every action is needlessly controlled by federal government whims, and citizens face radical racial oppression and direct harms. As the affirmative, we will present a method for DC statehood without a constitutional amendment that is both realistic, topical, and effective. Our first argument examines the critical nature of the local DC government, where we will demonstrate the importance of DC autonomy. Right now, tangible impacts of congressional control are being felt by U.S. citizens through a freeze on spending, meaning DC cannot spend the funds it has independently collected. According to Samantha Waxman, Deputy Director of State Policy Research 3/2025, legislation enacted earlier this month will force DC to cut its fiscal year 2025 budget by $1 billion by limiting how much it can spend of its own DC-raised funds to 2024 levels. Funds DC raised for its own residents and businesses to fund schools, firefighters, child care providers, businesses, and many other services in the district. And just over a week ago, Campbell Robertson, reporter for National Desk at the New York Times for 2025, wrote that the situation grew urgent when the House left without approving all agencies. Now that would face hiring and overtime freezes. But under federal law, the city needs permission from Congress to spend its own money. But congressional meddling in DC affairs isn't new, demonstrated by their ban on needle exchanges in the district that cost money and lives. According to Lauren Ober, award-winning radio producer and board member of the Association of Independence Radio 2015, writes that in the district, a local needle exchange program, volunteer Maurice Abbey Bay explained that people who inject drugs often cook their drugs with whatever they can find. Quote, things become real desperate when they have a drug habit. And needle exchanges in the district have helped curtail desperate and potentially dangerous behavior and the spread of diseases like HIV and hepatitis C. But it hasn't been easy. In 1998, Congress banned the use of federal funds for needle exchange programs, but local municipalities could still use their own money to pay for such, except in the district. Now, after that ban was lifted at the end of 2007, Mayor Fenty allocated $650,000 to the Department of Health to start syringe exchange providers, and in 2 years there were 120 new cases of HIV prevented and roughly $44 million saved. Now, our second argument today concerns the impacts of racial oppression and how arguments against statehood are inextricable from racism. Arguments against statehood are rooted in racism, specifically Red Scare propaganda, specifically fears about a socialist takeover. David Litt, former senior speechwriter for Barack Obama in 2020, writes that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell thinks, quote, this is a full-bore socialism on the march. Now, it's not surprising that McConnell's against statehood. The district would all but certainly add 2 Democrats to the Senate. However, his talking points against statehood echo the last gasps of the Jim Crow era. McConnell's claim that DC statehood would be, quote, full-bore socialism is rooted in the fight over statehood for Hawaii. Hawaii was a majority non-white resident state, and they were a logical candidate for statehood. However, segregationists adamantly opposed admitting Hawaii, and they buried their true objections behind a different argument. They argued Hawaii was a hotbed of communism. Now, Hawaii was eventually admitted, but only after the passage of civil rights acts, and now Washington, too, appears primed for statehood, yet 700,000 people remain disenfranchised. Of course, if admitted, Washington would also join Hawaii as the only second majority non-white state. Efforts to minimize the impact of non-white voters is the context in which statehood has been denied. And absent statehood, voter suppression for black and brown voices continues. ACLU of DC explains that the Home Rule Act was monumental, but stopped just short of granting full rights to the people of DC, the only national capital in the democratic world whose citizens do not have equal voting and representation rights, the only one, judges. And an egregious example of ongoing voter suppression is happening in our country today by denying district statehood, which is rooted in racism. And now, statehood would generate enough revenue to actually fund new racial justice initiatives, getting at the root of discriminatory policies that DC locally supports. As Erica Williams and Nikki Mexter wrote for DC Policy Institute, as a state, DC would take on many of the expenses for which Congress provided relief for. The revenue gains surpass the cost, and revenue from taxing could be as high as $1.4 billion, which is a sizable increase in resources that would be directly invested into programs for racial justice. The district has a limited ability to tax property now, and the option of taxing these properties. And long-standing inequalities in the district hold back black and brown people. For example, white households own 81 times the wealth of black households in DC. Now, finally, our advocacy today, judges. DC can be admitted as a state without a constitutional amendment. Again, without a constitutional amendment, while still providing insulated federal jurisdiction. The Washington, D.C. Admission Act provides a way for D.C. statehood that preserves federal control over federal buildings. This advocacy provides the aforementioned benefits without the harms of a constitutional amendment. Brenner Center for Justice 2021 says, the District Clause empowers Congress to establish a federal district not exceeding 10 miles square, but the framers made a fateful omission. They failed to provide representation for the district's future residents. The Washington, D.C. Admission Act turns present-day Washington, D.C. into a new state, while leaving a small district comprising of federal grounds to remain under congressional authority. Can Congress admit D.C.? Yes. The Constitution vests Congress with broad power to admit new states, and Congress's exclusive authority over the district includes the power to revise its boundaries. In 1846, Congress actually exercised this power, and there's precedent to return land that was previously ceded to Virginia. The District Clause contains, quote, sweeping and inclusive language permitting Congress to alter the district's contours. And what is the whole point of this? That our advocacy is critical because of an imminent federal takeover, which my partner will get into in their speech. Congress has actually already introduced a bill to eradicate the entire local DC government, so DC statehood is needed now. I stand ready for cross-examination.
Is this debate about democracy?
This debate is about statehood, primarily.
Okay. What is your response to the fact that 2/3 of Americans are opposed to DC statehood?
I believe actually the most recent numbers said that it was around 51% who are actually in favor nationally.
Where? What poll is that? I've read like every poll on it. Americans have been opposed to DC statehood for like 3 decades. Can you say?
Yeah, if you give me a second to pull it up, my opponent actually will be able to provide that
Okay,
information.
I'm gonna move on. Next question. Are you aware that DC receives $750 million in funding for the federal government?
That is actually not a very large amount compared to the overall money they have. It's only
Well,
about
that's just for the
30%.
criminal justice system, to be clear.
Sorry?
That's for the criminal justice system, to be clear.
So the federal government provides X amount of money just for criminal justice to DC?
Yes. Are you aware they also provide $90 million in funding to DC for education?
Total. Sure. I wasn't aware of that.
Are you aware that 25% of DC's economy comes from support from the federal government that they only get because they are a district? These are funds they would not get if they were a state, correct?
Absolutely. I think all of the examples that you're
Okay.
giving right now are examples of the
I wanna
fact
ask
that
another
DC
question.
isn't a district, therefore because it's not a
So
state.
you
it
said
means
you were
that-
going to add taxes, correct, to make up for the loss of revenue?
I'm not going to. The DC government, if they become a state,
Sure.
is obviously going to impose some taxes.
So DC already has the highest federal income tax in the world. Who do you think will be hurt by more taxes?
Saying that DC has the highest federal income tax doesn't take into the account that they have no state tax because they're not a state.
Yes, that's in fact my point, that there will be more taxes if we also implement a state tax. On top of that, that's aimed to bring back $1.2 billion in revenue. Answer my question. Who will be hurt by that?
If they become a state, the taxes that they impose due to statehood mean that the taxes
How
on the federal
wealthy-
level will be decreased.
I think that you're dodging my question, so I'll ask it in a different way. How wealthy do you think the average person in DC is?
Well, as I've pointed out right now, majority black individuals, which make up, this is a black plurality state, are actually impoverished.
Okay, so I ask you again, if we raise taxes,
Yes,
because
I
we now need a
understand.
state tax to make up for that loss of revenue,
If
who
you
will
let
be
me
hurt?
If you let me answer, then I can get an answer out to you that'll make sense. So
Is-
what I'm trying to say is that right now, If DC is not a state, they don't have any state income tax. Right now they have a higher federal income tax because they don't have a state one. If they become a state, that means that it's
Okay, I'm
probably
gonna
going to
move
equal out
on.
and those
Can
black
we
individuals
talk
will
about-
not be harmed.
Can we talk about COVID?
Sure. What do you have a question?
Yes. Are you aware that the CARES Act for COVID was based on population? So DC received a disproportionate amount of funding based on the population.
Disproportionately large or small?
Proportionate. Like they received the same money as everybody else.
Sure.
So your first example of DC being treated unfairly seems to be that you misrepresented what actually occurred.
Just because they're treated fairly with the COVID issue doesn't mean that all of the racial minorities who make up the
Okay,
state
let's
are
talk about
being
racial
disenfranchised.
minorities. So that funding that comes from the federal government, particularly in regards to education, is particularly allocated towards Black and Brown communities,
So we're not-
specifically to support those regions. So what do you think happens to them if they lose that funding?
So we're not actually advocating for losing any federal funding. We're advocating for just
Okay, it's not about what you're advocating, like you said, it's about DC. And are you aware that DC officials themselves and agencies had said they're going to have to cut programs in criminal justice, housing, education to fund statehood?
I think right now, the current administration is actually discussing massive cuts to many
You're not
different
really
states.
answering the question. The question is, if this is a debate about criminal justice, about racial justice, or issues of criminal justice, education not key?
This is a debate about statehood. It's not just about criminal
Well, it
justice.
just sounds
racial
like
justice,
you're
it's
talking-
just one aspect.
I'm just confused, because it feels like you're talking about statehood, but you're also talking about sacrificing the people who live in that state.
But
So
we're
I
not
don't
sacrificing them. We're giving
understand.
them more rights. We're giving them representation. We're giving them access
I think
to
they'd like to
$1.4
be able to eat
billion.
and go to school.
I'm ready whenever everyone else is. Are y'all good to go? Yeah, perfect. The founders created Washington as a federal city, so the operations of the government would be safe and free from domination by the states around it. James Madison wrote in Federalist 43, the indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of the government carries its own evidence with it. Over 2 centuries later, most Americans agree, the Gallup poll found in 2021, that 2/3 of Americans oppose making DC a state. Thus, Wake Forest is extremely proud to negate. DC statehood would be absolutely detrimental for 2 key reasons. The first is national security. Lawyer Zach Smith explains in the Ohio State Law Journal in 2022, history teaches us on multiple levels, state control over the seat of the federal government is net harmful. The very safety of the White House is put in jeopardy with state control, even with a carve-out for federal buildings. In June 1783, a group of disgruntled Continental soldiers surrounded the Congress in Philadelphia. Pennsylvania's governor refused to call out the militia to protect members of Congress. The physical safety and security of the federal government and its members were paramount to the framers, and if the District of Columbia becomes a state, the federal government's ability to provide for the physical security of its officers, employees, and property is severely hampered. Portions of the fencing that recently surround the Capitol complex and the inaugural parade route would fall within the territory of the new state. Under current statehood proposals, that neighborhood would be permanently and perhaps irrevocably cut off from the Capitol. Jeopardizing the safety of the White House is a massive national security threat. Second, when considering statehood, it is imperative to consider the costs. Statehood not only devastates national democracy, it severely puts into jeopardy the necessary services for the people of DC. The DC Fiscal Policy Institute finds in 2021, the largest source of DC revenue are local taxes and federal funds, with federal government funding accounting for over 25% of DC's revenue. This begs the question repeatedly asked by Representative Keller of Pennsylvania, how would DC pay for statehood? The answer, unfortunately, is through sacrificing citizen needs. The Washington Post reports in 2021, Democrats say the city is now self-sufficient, but the numbers don't add up. DC agencies compiled estimates that show the city would need to spend anywhere from minimum $755 million to maximum $2 billion annually on state government functions. The article goes on to say, DC could lose more than $90 million in education funds appropriated by Congress if it becomes a state. In fact, government officials confirmed that statehood would be financed by program cuts rather than taxes. The Washington Post finds Beverly Perry, senior advisor to Mayor Muriel, said the district, rather than taxes for DC residents or commuters should shift spending priorities and delay products to cover the cost of statehood. Even more devastatingly, the DC delegate to Congress has gone so far as to say when discussing statehood, quote, the district doesn't want any special treatment and is fully prepared to lose the money. It has to pay for everything that a state pays for. Housing and education projects will be first on the chopping block. When comparing the likelihood of spending cuts to consumer taxes in funding statehood, the article continues. The mayor is inclined to reconfigure spending. The mayor's latest proposals, $400 million for affordable housing, $1.57 billion for education and public schools, are, as the mayor puts it, quote, sacrifices that we are going to have to make to become a state. These sacrifices are especially damaging for the education system. Michael Maloney of Georgetown notes in 2019, DC school districts are the highest government subsidized school districts in the United States. The educational inequities mainly affect people in poor areas. So not only will DC lose $90 million in federal educational funding, but the government has stated that education and housing will be cut in order to finance the affirmative. Second, not only does statehood cut critical programs for DC residents, but it abandons them in times of economic downturn. That's critical as a recession is impending in DC as we debate. The Washington Post finds this week on April 19th, economists believe that government layoffs and looming budget cuts will push DC into a recession. David Schleier explains that in a recession, statehood would be devastating for DC for two reasons. Number one, DC's status as a relatively small, entirely urban area has left scholars torn on whether the economic benefits outweigh the costs. Such a single city state would face drastic risks in time of downturn. It would be entirely one economic region, meaning most necessarily the state would face substantial financial risks in case of shocks. States frequently redistribute money from the successful parts of the state to the unsuccessful to mitigate regional downturns, but New Columbia would not have this ability. Second, in the event of fiscal catastrophe, DC would be ineligible for Chapter 9 bankruptcy. If the people of DC truly need voting rights and it's worth the federal sacrifice, there is a much better alternative than one that jeopardizes national security and triggers economic devastation. Dr. Keith Knopfman notes in 2021, the best approach is retrocession, that is returning the vast majority of DC back to Maryland. And how do we know this will work? Because it has worked. Naughton continues, retrocession already has a precedent as the District of Columbia originally included the cities of Arlington and Alexandria that were retroceded to Virginia in 1846. Not only does retrocession solve the representation issue, but it would also be in the broader interest of the people of DC. Being part of a larger polity, Maryland reduces the risk of an inherent small, narrowly focused economy and geography. DC would have a backstop for economic problems and greater political control. As a part of Maryland, DC residents would still have federal power, as Maryland would be the 17th largest state, with 16 states in front of it representing over 230 million Americans and 70% of the population. Plus, depending on how Maryland draws its congressional district map, Washington could have more than one House member. Baltimore, with over 600,000 residents, has 3. Most importantly, retrocession would give DC residents representation now instead of waiting and hoping for a couple of senators. For Republicans, retrocession is the perfect counter to the representation argument and puts Democrats on the back foot. Outside of DC and the activist left, turning DC over to Maryland would be a sensible compromise. In the interest of preserving democracy, fostering United States national security, and preserving the fundamental rights and needs of DC citizens, Wake Forest is extremely proud to negate. Thank you, I'm good for class.
Starting now. So it was a great speech, but I just have a few questions to get into.
Yeah, for sure.
When did James Madison die?
Long time ago.
About 200 years, right?
Yep.
Okay. You talk about jeopardizing the safety of the White House. How is that?
Well, right now, if you have a state government that's able to call the National Guard in the face of the federal government, that puts our entire national security, the Capitol building, the White House, at the whims of the state government, which is, well, obviously pretty bad if you're the federal government.
Okay, but you recognize that the affirmative advocacy is to keep the White House within the district that we are maintaining, correct? So
Yeah.
the National Guard could still go in and
But
save the
it
White
keeps
House.
the White House, but not the streets across from the White House. So even if the White House is protected, all of the entire streets, the surrounding areas, are part of the now state of DC. Still, the military can't get through if those streets are blocked off.
Okay, but technically, if there is a federal government emergency, federal authority supersedes local authority, correct? They can't just block the federal government
But
from going to the White
that would
House.
complicate it. It would delay it. So even if they have superiority, if these streets
Do we
surrounding the
have
White
any
House,
precedent of that?
Oh, well, there's no precedent of DC being a state.
But
so
do we
no.
have any precedent of the federal government not being able to gain admission somewhere militarily because
Well,
of the local government?
again, we're debating the hypothetical of DC statehood, so I
Right,
don't
but
have
do
a
you have
past
any
precedent
evidence?
for something that hasn't occurred.
No, but not for
because
DC, I'm saying any other federal building
This
in
is
the
the only
country.
capital that we have in this country is DC. I'm
Okay.
confused about how I can have evidence for that.
Again, I'm not asking about the Capitol, I'm talking about any federal building in the United States that's been prohibited entry by the military of the federal government by a local authority.
I mean, I would tell you it's unique to DC specifically because of how politicized
Okay.
DC is. It's fundamentally more left-leaning, so the chances of the discrepancies between state and federal governments is uniquely likely.
Okay, so getting into
And
this.
in Pennsylvania, that did happen, as mentioned in case.
Okay, so with the federal funding, you said that essentially 25% of the funding for DC is from the federal government, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, and then what happens if DC retrocedes into Maryland?
They would have access to Maryland's funding.
Okay, but they wouldn't have access to that federal funding that you claim is so important for all the education
No,
and
but they would
racial
have the
issues.
support for Maryland's funding.
Okay, so you're essentially saying that Maryland is going to do a better job than the federal government because you
I'm-
care a lot about these racial issues, right?
No, 100%, but I'm saying if you merge the resources of DC with Maryland, that gives you access to better economic backing than simply residing on one very, very small economy that's susceptible to economic shocks.
So the DC citizens, the 700,000 individuals, which is a greater populace than Vermont and Wyoming, aren't actually capable of making decisions as a state and gaining enough revenue, even though these other two states can?
I mean, you haven't provided a metric for how they're gaining like $1.2 billion
Well, I'm
back.
well, I have provided the metric of
What is it?
$1.4 billion in revenue gained from statehood by my direct source.
But from what?
From the fact that once they become a state, they have increased taxation powers on property
But
that
the
was formerly not able to be taxed.
The problem with that makes complete sense in theory. I 100% agree with you. But when you ask the officials of DC, the mayor, the delegate, they're telling you that it's not going to be through taxes and it's going to be financed through program cuts. So ideally, that may work, but that's not the actuality that these officials
Okay,
are saying.
but
Second, the taxes are going to be on the poorest people of DC and increasing their taxes.
Okay,
on
there's absolutely no evidence saying that all the taxes are gonna fall on the poorest people. If anything, they
So
would
what
be on the
type of tax
richest.
is it?
Sorry, I'm asking the questions.
Yeah.
If anything, they would be on the richest individuals. And then also just to point out that your own advocacy of retroceding into Maryland gets rid of all that federal funding, which your essential first three contentions are saying is so important. So you're actually contradicting yourself. Do you agree?
No, not really. Because when you join Access with Maryland, you have access to all of their economic resources.
Okay, so
as
how much
well.
economic resources is Maryland willing to give DC citizens right now? Do you have a number?
I mean, they're not seated with Maryland. So.
Have they said that they will give support?
Yes.
How much money? I'm asking.
Well, it's a hypothetical question, so they can't commit a number for something that's not actually being done.
It's a hypothetical question, but they can't produce any type of number. Okay.
I mean, they
Thank
committed to it last week and leaving Trump, so no, they haven't done the analysis.
I'm gonna use the stand.
Okay.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
it's-
Yeah.
Okay, are we all ready to go? Yep. Cool. For a quick order, it's just gonna be the neg case in pretty much the order it was presented. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Top level, first of all, they talk about how DC citizens don't want statehood or how the country doesn't want statehood for DC. They're wrong about these poll numbers. A poll taken in February 2021 on behalf of Democracy for All specifically found that 54% of voters backed statehood while only 35% avoided it or opposed it. Again, I just want to clear up the numbers because they're just wrong about the polls that have been taken and the most recent evidence. Moving on to case proper, first they talk about this sort of idea of physical protection for the federal government. As Angela touched on in cross-ex, there's actually no reason why the federal government isn't going to be still able to call the National Guard, isn't still going to be able to be protected, and they can't provide you a piece of evidence where that's true. Because empirically, and it's just writ large true, that the federal government can override any sort of state action in the event of a federal emergency. So if the president needed to call in the National Guard to the White House or the Capitol building, that is a thing that could still happen even if DC were a state, because it would override all sort of state policy. Even if streets were closed, it doesn't make a tangible difference into how fast the National Guard can actually get there if they're not going to have a piece of evidence that says it does. Next, moving on to the idea of taxes and funds. We bring up in the Williams evidence in Evangeline's first speech how statehood would necessarily include an increase in taxes. Like every other state taxes things like property, income made by non-residents, all sorts of things that statehood includes. They say that statehood would be completely funded by no taxes and by program cuts, which is like not how statehood works. Even if the mayor has specifically said they might have to cut programs, I would argue that there is absolutely no way Washington, D.C. would not at least try to tax property or the income made by non-residents that it currently cannot do right now in the event of statehood. Which is why, at the end of the day, statehood is going to actually increase the budget for Washington, D.C. and make it more viable for them to be a state. And additionally, they keep saying that D.C. will not get federal funding after it becomes a state. I want you to think about every other state in the nation that still receives federal funding despite not being a territory of the federal government. Even if D.C. loses some amount of funding for things like education, that doesn't mean that they are never going to receive federal money ever again. Again, we're talking about a question of statehood. Every other state in the nation receives federal funds. We found evidence that it would increase funding by $1.4 billion in the district from taxes alone, not including federal dollars, which is sufficient to cover the $90 million deficit that our opponents bring up. And also, they talk about how DC won't have the fiscal ability or like sort of the fiscal fallback to become a state. Again, this is just like writ large not true. See COVID, where every economy and every industry was on a downturn, the federal government supplemented. If that were to happen in DC, there's no evidence that the federal government wouldn't step in, particularly because DC is right on their doorstep and so important and where many of their like workers live. Moving on to the retrocession counter plan. So first, top level on retrocession, it doesn't actually resolve most of the affirmative case, particularly because retrocession into Maryland doesn't actually strengthen the DC local government, which we've already cited is so critical. DC's local government is really good at knowing what their locality needs. There's no evidence that Maryland is actually going to invest the time, funding, etc. into DC in order to make it viable. We think that it's necessary and important that DC's local government gets strengthened, because generally local governments are far preferable to the federal government or other big governments because they're insulated from polarization. This also includes state governments, because local governments are like city governments. As explained by the Carnegie Corporation in New York in 2024, local governments are largely insulated from the harshest effects of polarization in America. Cooperative relationships across different groups are frequently forged in local government. The majority of governance happens at the local level. 87% of local government leaders believe political polarization negatively affects the country. Less than 1/3 perceive the same negative effect with their local communities. Local elected officials maintain functional relationships in red, blue, and purple communities. Participating in local activities buffers ideological differences, which is why it's so critical to strengthen DC's local government, something that the Maryland retrocession counterplan doesn't do. Additionally, the funding issue still exists and is magnified under the Maryland counterplan because DC would have less authority to tax over its own locality because the taxes would go to Maryland and be decided by the Maryland state government, not DC authorities, which means that they won't have access to all sorts of funding that the NEG claims is so necessary. Additionally, they would lose the federal education funding, meaning that if DC loses a bunch of federal funding that we think is so necessary and also cannot raise the funds to cover that deficit, in the next counterplan world, we are going to see magnified impacts of lack of funding. They have zero evidence as to why Maryland's funding is going to be a sufficient amount to cover this deficit. They say it only happened 10 days ago, but Maryland retrocession has been an idea for decades. It's not viable because Maryland is A, not willing to include DC, and B, the funding mechanism isn't there. They will not be able to give you a warrant in this debate as to why retrocession for Maryland actually resolves the funding issue. It also doesn't resolve our racial oppression advantage because it doesn't provide specific representation for the voters in DC. Even if they were to get some House seats, it doesn't actually make a difference because when they have Senate representation, that is specifically why DC needs statehood to have representation in the Senate. The Senate is the body that decides most legislation. So many things pass the House, but the Senate is where legislation really gets held up. Having 2 DC senators in the Senate allows them to have a greater voice in federal legislation and to pass legislation that actually benefits their locality and their state. Under an affirmative world, that is the only way that you're going to see solvency of our impacts and DC residents getting the enfranchisement that they deserve. With that, I am open for cross.
taxes are going to fund statehood?
It wasn't an official, it was an economic analysis from...
Okay, is there any official, anyone in the DC local government that you say is important that has said statehood will be funded through taxes?
No one has said it because
Alright.
it is implied with the word statehood.
It's
States-
not. What kind of tax specifically are you advocating?
Sure, there's a couple. So one is taxing the income of non-residents, and the second is property taxes.
Okay,
Those are the
sounds
two
good.
big ones.
And you said that it would be reallocated for racial justice. What official law, anything says that?
Yeah, so that is the likelihood of what's happening in DC. It's the likely extension. So in the status quo, DC is very
Likely extension according to who? To what?
According to
William,
Erica Williams and Nikki
Yeah.
Netzer, DC Policy Institute as of 2023.
Okay, that's not from an official though, is it?
That's from 2 policy analysts in DC who
I think that we
arguably know a
both
lot about
agree
the
that
issue.
DC's local government is really important on this issue. So is there anyone from that institution that says it should be reallocated for racial justice?
I mean, I'm not sure if like the fiscal policy initiative isn't enough for you, but no specific
private
initiative,
entity.
specific official is like saying
Alright.
this is specifically what happened because DC
Yeah,
state.
absolutely. You said that DC's local government is really, really strong, right?
We think that they could be, and they are
Okay.
critical to the locality of DC.
Yeah,
Currently, they're being
absolutely.
dampened by the
I
federal government.
completely agree with you. So if that local government is saying that statehood would be subsidized by program cuts rather than taxes, and you are saying that government is strong, why wouldn't that be the case?
I think that there is a world where both are happening, but I think that is the necessary world of like the actual world. Like
I
when
mean, that's not what those officials are saying, but it's okay. Do Republicans support statehood?
some do, most don't.
So the majority of the House, the Senate right now, the White House, we can say doesn't support it.
Sure, they have said that they probably don't.
Yeah, perfect. So why would a red Senate, red House, like red presidency, ever give federal funding to a state of DC that they have vehemently opposed?
Yes, so I think there are a couple of answers to this. The first is that DC statehood would add would necessarily, in all likelihood, add 2 Democratic senators to the Senate, leaving
So what?
the... Do you want me to finish
Yeah,
the
please.
answer?
Go
Or you guys
ahead.
another one? Okay.
For sure.
So it would add 2 Democratic senators to the Senate, meaning that the majority by the Republicans is only 1 senator, which is important when it comes to things like funding for states,
But
because
Republicans would still have the majority, no?
sure, by 1 vote, but if you want me to like actually answer your questions, I'd appreciate if you didn't interrupt me.
I mean, you can continue answering, I just thought it was sufficient.
Yeah, okay, sure. If you have another question, go for it.
No, I'd really like for you to finish. If they have if the Republicans still have the majority, and you've said they all oppose statehood, then why would they ever give substantial amounts of federal funding to an entity that is basically spit in their faces and goes against everything that the party stands for?
Yeah, so that's actually not what I said, because I think that, sure, most Republicans are probably opposed to statehood in the status quo. However, once DC becomes a state, a lot of Republicans are actually interested in federal funding to states.
Who?
I mean, see every state that has federal funding, it requires bipartisan support to pass.
Okay, naturally, I completely agree that all officials out there think that states generally should get some semblance of some federal funding. But insofar as none of them want DC to be a state, why would they ever fund something that they don't want to exist in the first place?
I'll just interject here and note the fact that right now the federal government, which is currently under the Trump administration, has continued to provide federal funding to Democratic states. This is not a revolutionary idea that a red government is going to fund blue states.
Yeah, it's not a revolutionary idea, but the funding that all of these states are getting aren't funding that are allocated specifically towards districts. Like, can you name me one state that has such a large proportion of their GDP subsidized exclusively by the federal government?
No, because we have no other districts except for DC.
Right, naturally. So how are you going to come up with $1.2 billion extra dollars?
Well, we're getting $1.4 billion increased revenue from the increased taxes, as we have already spoken about for the 3rd time by
Is it a
Williams and
progressive
Netzer.
or regressive tax?
It's a property tax, which is different from a progressive or regressive income tax.
Okay.
It's the biggest one. There's
So what piece of evidence states you're getting $1.4 billion specifically from property tax?
It's the Williams evidence from our first speech. I don't know how many times you want me to say it.
Okay, yeah, absolutely, that's promise. Thank you.
Yes.
Perfect. Representation means nothing if your city can't afford to keep the lights on. We've advanced a major disadvantage to statehood, and that's the economy. And we've proposed a more productive alternative that solves the main offense without destroying DC. First off, let's get back into the econ, because they fundamentally misunderstand the reality of what statehood would mean, and they oversimplify matters, which is why we continue to not truly engage with the matter of what DC statehood would mean for the lived experience of the black residents in DC. Let's start with spending cuts. Let's talk dollars and cents. It is a fact of the matter that DC statehood would trigger massive funding losses. Reports estimate the cost would be $2 billion, and this is coming from DC's own leaders who are admitting the gap will be covered by cuts to core services. This estimate that we've received did not get made up by a random economist, and not by any policy nations. It's an estimate provided directly from DC agencies. They are saying every single year $2 billion needs to be come up, and they're saying in the poorest, the main answer to this negative is that it will be funded by a property tax. That's not a good idea. The DC Policy Institute says the poorest fifth of residents, quote, with a property tax of 1.5% have a burden that is equal or higher to almost all other income groups. Additionally, the top 1% pay the least in property tax with a burden of 0.8% of income. Their answer to tax more will hurt the poorest of DC. They miss the fact that taxes are not a good solution. In fact, they are regressive and they hurt the bottom of the population. They hurt the most vulnerable. Second, they say they're going to tax housing, and my response to that is, how has that gone for every other state in the union that's facing housing crises? And in DC, where housing is already really difficult to get your hands on, taxing it only makes this process worse. Their third response to this was a commuter tax. My answer to this is twofold. One, commuter taxes are deeply unpopular with both DC residents and, of course, the people who will be hit by commuter taxing. And most DC officials have stated they are not in favor of it because of its deep unpopularity. So those are all three responses they gave you the econ advantage, and we've proven that they're not only insufficient, but make the situation worse. Now, let's move into subpoint A, education. DC would lose $90 million in federal education funding, and the DC Policy Center outlines what's at stake. We're talking teacher pay, low-income student programs, school materials, even COVID recovery funds. All of this gets gutted in the world of the affirmative. What good is a senator if kids can't read? They say DC will receive state funding. Republicans hate the idea of DC statehood and have no incentive to revive such bailouts. Second, the courts. This is what they've dropped. The DC Policy Center, in a report commissioned by Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, outlines the deep financial dependence of DC's court system on federal support. The DC court system depends on federal dollars for staff, infrastructure, defender service, and pensions. Don't let them get away with saying, well, DC relies on the federal government a little bit. It's not a little bit. It's a lot of it, actually. It's a lot of it. We already saw a microcosm of what the world of the affirmative looks like. In 2018, modest cuts in the budgets forced 100+ layoffs in criminal justice. Nearly 10% of the workforce. I say it again, 1 in 10 people in criminal justice got cut from a modest budget trim, and this budget trim came from slightly less federal funding, to be clear. Imagine what happens with full federal funding withdrawal under statehood. A gutted court system doesn't just slow down, it breaks, and with it, the promise for DC citizens. Now, third, product collapse. Those are just two areas, and we could go on and on listing the various industries and areas that will be hurt if they lose federal funding. Second, shocks and recession. Their main response to this is that DC will gain more money, but what they miss is that our argument about structural recession is structural. DC is one-dimensional. That means it's more vulnerable to shocks. It's more vulnerable to recession, and it does not have the tools of other states to respond when they're in crisis. And we're winning that this is impending. This is now. DC is heading towards a recession, and they need the ability to get help from the federal government. Otherwise, they're doomed. That's our Schleicher evidence. Now, let's talk retrocession. DC statehood is a dangerous gamble, but there's a better option. Retrocession. Retrocession gives representation while creating a fragile microstate, and Maryland already serves 6 million people. It's bigger, it's more stable, has a larger economy, and far less volatile than a single city state. If this is really about representation, retrocession solves it. And in fact, we are the ones who are in line with the way people who are talking about statehood are currently speaking about it. Just last week, Representative Jamie Raskin, a progressive icon and DC native, recently admitted, this is the representative of Maryland to be clear, quote, if you guys want to think about coming out to Maryland for this period, you will definitely be safer in a free state than you will under the rule of thumb of mag colonization, end quote. Coming from a longtime statehood champion, it's a jarring reality check. If you want to protect DC residents, it's time to let go of statehood because it's a fantasy that is not practical. Political senior editor Michael Schaefer really breaks down the reality of statehood. Quote, would you rather live in a place that has to create a universal system or judiciary based on a population only a bit larger, tiny Vermont or Wyoming, or do a decently sized state that does stuff pretty well already? End quote. It's about actual resistance. I'm going to touch on the racial justice point, and I'm going to say 4 things. First, Historically, black states and countries that are created about economic support fail. See Haiti, see Libya. Those situations are not good. Second, if the first state to go bankrupt, if the first black majority state goes bankrupt, what message does that send to black populations? And how do you think Trump will respond? Third, our point about DC not getting funding from federal funding is furthered by an all-Republican Senate. They want DC to become a state, they want to fail, and then they want to demonize the black residents. Fourth, their articulations about racial justice ring empty as far as they have sacrificed DC citizens for their own political ambitions. Thank you.
I'm gonna take 2 minutes of cross.
Yes. Okay, are you good?
Yep.
Okay, so do you think, like, writ large, the DC government officials are the most important people to listen to in this debate?
About the realities of statehood, yeah, it seems like they would know a thing or two. We're
Cool,
not just
so-
talking about officials, but also like agencies. We're talking about like economists who are being commissioned to ask questions about what these cost. Like,
Yeah.
yes, these are the people we logistics because they know the economics. They've commissioned economists. They're talking to state agencies directly. And then I'm saying, separately from that, there's a moral question about if it's ethical to sacrifice the black residents of DC.
Okay.
And I'm saying the answer to that question is no.
Okay, so you're defending that we should listen to the data and the numbers that the local government has found when it comes to the cost of statehood, but not the conclusion that they've drawn based on
I
what
think
they've
that sounds
discussed in their
incredibly
locality.
reasonable. I think you just repeated an incredibly reasonable statement.
Okay, cool. I just want to make sure we're on the same page there.
I mean, like, I think it's kind of worrying that you've not contested my claim that you're in favor of sacrificing black residents. You just, like, made dunks about how it might be hypocritical. Do you think it's okay to sacrifice the black residents of DC?
Obviously not.
It's not obvious to me.
Okay, I'm sorry about that, I guess, but I have more questions to ask about the case proper.
Sure.
Starting on the funding question, are Republicans really big fans of states like California, Vermont?
So, we've laid out a key, first, California is like one of the biggest economies in the world. Like, what are you talking about? And Trump has threatened and has delayed funding from California, like in recent history.
What funds?
I believe it was funding for the fires.
Okay, what funds for other blue states? Because if you
Wait, I've already given you one example. Are you gonna make me go down the list of every time Trump has denied funding?
Okay, that's fine. So, like, writ large, do you think that Republicans are going to continue to deny funding to all blue states? This includes
And I
DC, or is
think-
it a specific to DC issue?
First, I think your question misses one of the key points of our argument about Trump denying funding. It's not just about DC being a blue state, it's about DC being a majority black state. And we're saying that that is part of the reason that Trump would be inclined to deny funding.
Okay.
A, that DC is not already a state, so they don't already receive federal funding, so this is a unique situation.
Sure.
And two, because they would take the opportunity to demonize black residents, which we've already seen Trump do to countries like Haiti, who we call a shithole country, and denied funding to internationally, and we've already seen him do to citizens, like when he referred to the black residents as looters and rioters. I'm
Okay.
saying you're setting him up for a slam dunk opportunity to demonize her punity black residents.
Right. So if that's true, why haven't Republican governments in the past denied all funding to, like, states like Hawaii, which is also a minority
like,
plurality?
I don't think you're going to win that Republicans have treated Hawaii fairly. I mean, look at the way they treat
Yes,
black
but
and
why
brown
haven't they
residents during like
specifically-
residency. Look at how they
Right.
treated the black residents in New Orleans during Katrina. The history of how Republicans give grants to black places is not in your favor.
Sure, specifically on the argumentation in the debate that you talked about, if you are defending that the government is going to deny all federal funding to DC because it is a black state, why have they not denied all funding to
Precedented, paralyzing position that you would put DC as a state in. Second, I've pinpointed that DC is not just blue, it's all black. And that given the whole crux of Trump right now is to cut DEI, it seems like making an example out of DC, the first all-black state, that seems incredibly likely. In fact, I think it's impossible that you could argue otherwise.
So we're gonna take 2 minutes of preparation time. negation has provided for you today, and then I'm going to go over the affirmative case and why you should feel completely 100% confident voting for our ballot today. So to get right into it, I'm going to go back to this James Madison Federalist 43 argument. I'd like to point out the fact that in cross-examination I asked, when did James Madison die? And the point is that it was over 200 years ago, and the point is that the buffer method that the Federalists said they needed was when it actually mattered to have space between physical locations. With social media, with nuclear weapons, with long-range missiles, this is no longer an issue. Having a buffer state between the state and the district is no longer an issue, which is why the affirmative advocacy stands. Next, I'm going to get into some of the things that my opponent said in their last speech. First, they talk about the economy falling with statehood. They talk about this $90 million in education funding and the $2 billion estimate that's needed in total for total funds for DC. However, I'd like to start out by saying that the Neg's own advocacy for retrocession loses all of these benefits. Again, this is contradictory. If the negation is advocating right now for retrocession back into Maryland, they, by their own admission, are going to lose that federal funding by the federal government, the 25% that they say exists. Now, the next thing is that my opponent is saying that we're going to be taxing houses. No, that's not the fact. We are going to be taxing property. There is a difference. Specifically, I refer to 42% of current untaxable property that is not held by a single minority individual within the current district of Washington, D.C. We are going to be taxing the 42% of current untaxable property, not the homes of minority citizens. Next, my opponent talks about how 1 out of 10 individuals were cut on a budget trim, which actually proves the current need for statehood. The fact is that the federal government right now is actually messing with DC, which is my entire point about the current imminent federal takeover, which went completely unrefuted by the negation. Right now, the federal government wants to take over Washington, D.C. That is why they need statehood. That is why the status quo is important. Do you think that the Trump administration government right now is going to do a better job and care more about minority individuals than the local government of D.C., who sees these individuals on the street every single day? No, of course you don't believe that. Next, my opponent talks about the fact that D.C. is vulnerable to a recession if they become a state because they need federal funding. But as my partner was trying to explain, every single state in the United States of America receives federal funding. We are not advocating that the federal government fund 0% of Washington, D.C. And then the negation today is trying to claim that because D.C. is a blue state and because Trump doesn't want them to become a state, that for some reason that means that the entire federal government is going to cut every single penny that they give. We have democratic states in the United States of America that receive federal funding. And finally, my opponent talks about the non-white majority, essentially the fact that the state cannot succeed. This is a lie. This is a lie. It can, and we look exactly to the case of Hawaii. Yes, they might not have been a majority black population, but they were a majority non-white population who are just as important. And that group of individuals was able to successfully gain entry into the United States of America, and they retained the federal funding from the federal government. This proves every single harm that the negation has provided for you today. You can circle your ballot now. So to get into it, we're going to go over the case and why you should feel even more confident voting for the affirmation. The first thing that I'm going to go over is the affirmative impacts. Right now, we have the affirmative advocacy, which actually resolves the racial issues in D.C. I point to revenue gains of $1.4 billion by, and I'm going to say it super nice and clear, Williams and Metzger from 2023. $1.4 billion in revenue that is going to be gained from D.C. statehood. Next, I look at the impact of D.C. local control. Again, D.C. local control, which went completely unrefuted. The fact that D.C. local control, local governments have been proven to not only care more about the issues of their local residents, but to be more effective. And I'm going to point to a specific example in D.C. when D.C. local residents decided to paint and make a BLM plaza in Washington, D.C. But guess what? The GOP said that they were going to pull funding from Washington, D.C. if they didn't paint it over. And guess what, Judge? They had to paint it over because of the threat of that funding being pulled. That's why they need to be a state, so that they can support these racial issues, support these minorities, support these individuals that they care about. Next, we have the impact on the affirmative of the fact that there is representation for D.C. citizens. The negation has not provided to you any evidence that they are going to give a vote to the people. What is democracy built upon? It's built upon the right to vote. It's built upon the fact that we, as every single American citizen in the United States, deserves the right to cast their ballot. They deserve the right to say, this is the person I want in charge. This is the person I want to represent me. And yet, the negation's advocacy actually takes away that right by remaining in the status quo. Judge, that is massively important. important and went completely unrefuted. And then we looked at the impact of the fact that there is urgent action needed. Again, urgent action needed. This isn't an issue for the future. This isn't something that we can say, let's have them retrocede into Maryland and then we'll think about it, maybe a little while from now. No, this is an urgent action that needs to be dealt with today. Why? Because right now, Trump is saying actively that he wants to take over Washington, D.C. We all know what's going to happen if he does that. And finally, we have the affirmative impact of the D.C. Admission Act itself, which provides long-term support for the Democratic Party without upsetting the fragile political balance that is currently in place. How does it do that? Because it increases the amount of senators right now without upstaging that current political balance that we have, paving the way for future Democratic support and future Democratic leadership at the federal level so that they can work in tandem with the new D.C. state that we are going to be creating, and let me add, without a constitutional amendment. Again, without a constitutional amendment. Now, for all of those reasons, all of those impacts, and the harms of the negations case, you should feel confident voting for the affirmative.
I'm sorry guys. I'm ready whenever. Yeah, good to go.
Yeah.
The most fundamental question in this debate is what happens to the citizens of DC post-affirmative. The affirmative has theory, the negative has facts. There are three clear paths that lead to a negative ballot in today's debate. The first is spending cuts. It's impossible to discuss DC statehood without asking yourself two critical questions. Number one, what is the price? And number two, who is paying? The facts are simple. If DC becomes a state, we would need to spend at minimum $755 million and maximum $2 billion annually on state government functions. The affirmative cannot tell you who is footing the bill absent federal involvement, but the answer is simple, and it comes from current DC officials. They have repeatedly stated that in order to pay for statehood, DC will delay and cut from social welfare programs like healthcare, housing, education. The delegate to Congress to DC stated, quote, they're prepared to lose the money. The mayor has stated that $400 million for affordable housing and $1.57 billion for education are the sacrifices they need to make. Always prioritize this evidence beyond any conjecture from my opponents, because rather than their rhetoric, this is coming from the DC officials that would actually be enacting statehood. So if they're saying that it's cuts over taxes, then it's cuts over taxes. The affirmative is advocating for a policy that is opposed by the majority of Americans and that is subsidized by DC's poorest and most vulnerable residents. They say a couple of things. Number one, that it's going to be property taxes. Officials explicitly say it will not be property nor commuter taxes. There is not a shred of evidence in this debate that says otherwise. Second, even if they were property taxes, that is bad for DC's poor. The DC Policy Institute says the poorest fifth of residents with property taxes of 1.5% have a burden that is equal or higher than almost all income groups. Don't let them twist it in the last speech. They've clearly outlined property taxes. Even if those were passed, those are extremely bad for DC's poor. Second, they say the federal government will still fund DC. First, the funding being lost is exclusively available to districts, not states. They have conceded that there is no state in the US receiving the same proportion of federal funding as Washington, D.C. Second, an all-red House, Senate, White House is never, ever going to give substantial amounts of money to a state whose very existence they have approved and who makes a mockery of their entire platform. This isn't about them hating Democrats. It's about creating a state based on the values that Republicans staunchly oppose. They're not just going to throw billions of dollars at them when they refuse of the DC state's actual existence. Then they say that there's budget cuts in the status quo, but if you see such negative impacts for a few $1 million being lost, imagine the impact of billions of dollars being lost in funding in the affirmative world. The second place to sign your ballot confidently is our argument about economic distress that is conceded by the affirmative. Evidence from this week proves that DC is about to enter into a recession because of Trump's federal job cuts. Problematically, if DC becomes a state, recession is devastating for two key reasons. Number one, as a state, DC will not be able to apply for bankruptcy, which means they will not receive federal assistance. Second, DC only has one small and central economy. When states go into recession, they use money from the thriving part of the state to subsidize the struggling part of the state. But because DC is so small and so economically homogenous, they're not going to be able to reallocate that funding, which means in times of economic downturn, where they have no federal assistance and now no social welfare programs, it's those citizens that are suffering. Voting affirmative not only destroys welfare programs for DC's poorest and weakest, but simultaneously abandons citizens in times of economic downturn. The affirmative poses a question of racial justice, but there can be no justice in a state of economic devastation because that's a prerequisite to any substantive growth and to all of their impacts. Then, they emphasize the importance of the first primarily black state, but they could not create the first primarily black state, cut all of its social welfare programs, tank its economy, and expect that to go well. That reflects horrifically. And if the first predominantly black state in America fails economically, Trump will demonize them and use them as an example. The easiest place to vote, the third place to sign your ballot, is our argument about retrocession. It's the clearest solution and solves for every harm outlined by the affirmative. If you want representation, you will get it through Maryland's congressional seats. There is no difference between if you're represented through Maryland or locally because it's your same voters, it's the same people in Congress. Instead of creating the most fragile state in the world, look to what's historically worked. Give Maryland back to Maryland. It's worked before. Look to Alexandria. Look to Arlington. It's going to work again. Maryland is willing and wants to protect. We quoted Representative Janie Raskin. They literally want to give DC representation and freedom explicitly and have committed to this as recently as last week. Remember, Raskin was a former statehood advocate who swapped to advocating for retrocession precisely because she recognized the urgency of the situation and the need for an actually pragmatic solution. The affirmative is not taking seriously the position of DC. Retrocession solves DC residents who will vote for a president, get a House representative, vote for senators, and will be included in a state that is sympathetic to their difficulties and explicitly wants to help them, rather than creating an economically dissound small state with no social welfare programs. How does this not solve the question of representation? It does. The affirmative dropped all of their specific examples and collapsed down to shouting catchphrases about the representation of democracy. Then let's talk about how DC will be treated. Look to Hawaii. Hawaii was not treated well. During wildfires in 2023, Republicans were opposed to giving them revenue and demonized Hawaiians. You saw the same thing in California. Second, saying this debate is about racial justice and then saying racial bias towards black Americans is irrelevant is a choice. The reality is that the affirmative has conceded that in order for DC to stay afloat, it needs Trump to support them. And there is no reason to believe that Trump will do so. It is an extremely easy reason to vote negative. This is not just a question of Republicans disliking blue states, but one of the most aggressive presidents in our history who ran on shutting down DEI and the reality of how he would treat a predominantly black city. He would demonize them and punish them and love to see them fail, as he did with Haiti and as he did with BLM. At the end of the day, ask yourselves, what is happening to DC's residents? What is happening to DC's economies? In the end, DC needs to function, and the only way for them to do so is by voting neg. Thank you. Good debate.
Good debate.
want to thank both teams for an outstanding debate. And as per tradition in this final round, it is a 2-1 decision with a split between James and I. And Professor Romanelli voted negative, so it is a 2-1 decision for the negative from Wake Forest. Congratulations to Wake Forest. I will go first, since I voted aft. Ultimately, this is a question of statehood versus retrocession. This is not a conversation about whether or not DC would ever remain a district. So either, in my mind, do they become a part of Maryland or do they become an independent state? I don't think the status quo is an option as per the way in which this debate unfolds. There are two issues that become pertinent for why I think statehood is ultimately better than retrocession. To me, it seems that everyone is in agreement, as per a cross-examination, that the leaders in the district, we should listen to them about what they would like to have happen. The leaders have said that they are willing to embrace a significant amount of cuts as per the neg team in order to get statehood. And yes, there is an opportunity cost, but what everyone seems to have told me is that the leaders in the district are saying, we think statehood is more important than embracing those state cuts that could potentially happen. So that becomes one of the reasons why I think statehood is better than going to Maryland. Independence seems to be better and local control. There's no evidence that indicates that the local leaders seem to be willing to embrace retrocession to the degree that it seems that everyone is in agreement about statehood. There's also this question about local control, that if DC becomes an independent state, then they get local control. They get to make decisions about how those resources get allocated. Yes, I'm just with the AF on this question about federal funding. I'm just racking my brain on trying to think of what state is not receiving any federal funding or significant amounts. And I think that yes, there would probably be some reduction, but the ultimate question to me is what's the mix of resources that they get between property taxes, other types of sort of taxes on consumption, getting money from the federal government. Does it come sort of approximately close? I think that it is much, in my mind, closer to the AF's depiction of the economic world than your depiction of sort of just massive collapse and recession that takes place. And so then to me it becomes a question of who is better in control, who is more likely to spend those resources in a way that the current citizenry of the DC would want. And they have evidence that says that it should be local. I'm kind of suspicious about how the state of Maryland and the legislature there would spend money for this newly incorporated part of the state. So I think that statehood on those two issues seem to be better reasons, are better than retrocession. Status quo in my mind is not even an option here.
I disagree. But let me start off by a couple of acknowledgments. This was really a good debate, and I'm really happy I had a chance to watch this debate. The level of nuance, the level of detail that all four of you demonstrated is just not an amazing reflection on your institutions, but also this activity and the power of debate. So I just want to just start there by saying that what we just talked about in the last hour, some folks can't do in a whole year. And so that is just remarkable for all four of you. Now, in terms of how I saw the debate, I did think this debate between a counter plan versus AF debate. This was not like what the status quo. So I looked at this debate and saw all the disads that the negative is putting forth. I do think that you probably linked to some of these disads. The question is how much. I think the negative counter plan links a little less in a couple of places in terms of the representation argument. I don't think you can say that they won't get any representation. I think that there is probably maybe not as much as if you have representation as there being their own statehood, but I also think there's some disadvantages to statehood that outweigh having a retrocession counter plan. The other thing that I think that is not being answered at all is this demonization argument that the negative spends a lot of time on. Be a failure. I don't hear a really good response for why that won't be the case. So in my eyes, everything that Professor Lee said about creating a space for listening to locals, I think they will have good intentions. I think they will try to fight the good fight. But I think in this current political climate, the way in which they frame that narrative is too much for for DC statehood to be able to succeed. And so ultimately for me, the counter plan is the only viable option or alternative to be able to sustain representation for the people of DC. And I also think there was this nuanced distinction in the cross-ex that the 2A made about we can listen to the locals about the truth, about sacrifice, about their desire to sacrifice and that it will cost money. But at the same time, it doesn't deny that there won't be real material harm to people. And I didn't really hear a good response from the AF in this debate other than they're willing to make that sacrifice. And I guess in this debate, that was a sacrifice I wasn't willing to make in the sense that they are doing a lot of work to say that there are really people that will die, people that will be negatively impacted. And so those two things coupled, I think, are things that are not totally ignored with the counter plan, but they're less with the counter plan than with the AF. So let me be abundantly clear. I just think the counter plan does two things that the AF doesn't. I think it links less to the disads than the AF, and I think there's no real argument to how Trump uses this and the GOP uses this to either restrict all funding or use it to demonize the first predominantly black state in a way that it doesn't succeed. And so that's how I ended up voting in this debate. But great debate, though.
I'll start by saying phenomenal debate. On this topic, which is a nuanced, very tiny little topic, this is, obviously I judged you both, and this is the best debate I've seen on this. And it's razor thin for me, because I'm almost like, if I was voting on presumption, I could almost say that. I mean, I think you have a bit of a burden here that James is isolating, and it's those two things. If this debate happens almost 100 days ago, I vote here, because I don't have the fear that it's gonna be demonized. And I think both of you are not answering each other's arguments in two key places, which makes it hard for me. Theirs that the takeover's coming, and yours that the recession's coming. And I think the recession for sure is real, it's happening and things. So I think their impacts might happen a little bit quicker and more likely. And if Maryland is an opportunity, if it may fix some of these problems, I think I avoid some of the worst stuff. So that's what I end up basically the same. But tremendous job.